Okay, no news is good news is the name of my talk. Last week I was on holiday in Blakeney, a little village in Norfolk on the coast for the bank holiday weekend. And the first morning I went to the shop to get my breakfast, which was a large packet of chocolate hobnobs and some real coffee. It's a great way to start the day. And I'm standing in the queue waiting to pay, and my eyes are drawn to the newspapers and the newspaper headlines that are there next to me in the racks next to the till. And I see a rather depressing story about sort of pension scam, and in the Independent, a rather miserable story about how our class division is increasing in this country. In the Sun, scandalous story about footballers and prostitutes for a change. In the Eye, there was a rather depressing story about all the billions of pounds that had been wasted because that weekend we'd had a bank holiday Monday. In the Times, quite a depressing story, actually, about families losing money at the start of the new tax year. In the Mail, a depressing, scandalous story about the millions that was being pocketed by people running water companies, despite there being a water shortage. In The Guardian, a fairly depressing story about families in benefit traps. In the Mirror, a depressing and scandalous story about the victims of war and mental health amongst our soldiers. And so in desperation, my eyes scanned around the newspapers to settle on the good old local rag, the East Anglian Times. But sadly, there was a depressing story in that about obesity. And so in sheer desperation, my eyes settled upon the magazine for the discerning lady, Take a Break Monthly. And unfortunately in there was a depressing story about abuse and injustice. And I was forced to go to what I call my happy place, and remember a story from years ago about a kitten that had learnt how to skateboard. Now these photos I've shown you were all taken last weekend. They represent a typical day of our news headlines, and what a depressing collection of stories they are. We seem to scoop up the worst aspects of humanity and deliver them on a daily basis in our news. And the news to me is like a bleak soap opera. It's the same miserable stories of scandal and tragedy being churned out on a daily basis, weekly basis, yearly basis, the same stories being recycled, which is why 11 years ago I decided to take a holiday from the news, and I've never looked back. There is, of course, a maxim amongst journalists: if it bleeds, it leads. The more it bleeds, the more it's going to get a headline. And because this is TED, I thought it was my duty to put some statistics and a pie chart together. I don't have PowerPoint. I drew this myself, and I made up the statistics as well. So that's this is entirely fabricated, but I think it's probably true to life that tragedy and scandal makes up the bulk of our news stories, and comedy a small 5%. And when I use the word comedy, I'm referring to, in a broader sense, not just about humor, but also about love and compassion as well, in the way that the ancient Greeks used to describe life as being a mixture of comedy and tragedy. And in Shakespeare, for example, the tragedies, everybody got murdered and died by the end usually, and in the comedies they didn't, and usually they got married. And this is the reality of how our lives are. Our lives are a mixture of sweetness and sorrow and tragedy and joy, and yet if we were to believe the way the news sensationalizes the tragedy in life, it's no surprise that in providing us with these daily mantras, we have an epidemic of depression going on through the Western Hemisphere. According to my research, there is 1 in 5 people in America currently are clinically depressed. In the UK, according to a survey by the House of Commons, 41 million prescriptions for antidepressants were dished out last year. It seems that the news, I'm not saying the news is to blame for this, but the news is obviously a contributing factor, I think, to this level of unhappiness that's going on. It is bad medicine. And so I want to suggest, this is my offer for you today as to how to improve your happiness in your life. Very simply, give up the news. I realize that in suggesting this, there's a degree of irresponsibility. But I'd like to suggest it's not quite as irresponsible as you might think. We do have a duty to keep up with the news, but even though I gave up 11 years ago, I am almost depressingly well informed as to what's going on in the world. And that's even though I've no longer engaged with the news as delivered to me by the media, but because the important stories, the stuff that matters, the stuff that affects our lives, is the stuff that people talk about. So I learn about the news through my work colleagues and through my friends. And in many ways, it's a more healthy way to engage with the news because it's not being fed to me in a passive way. There is engagement and discussion around these stories. Although, as a friend of mine who is a journalist cynically said to me, "Isn't that letting other people do your dirty work?" And yes, absolutely, he's correct. And there is another insidious thing about the news that I've noticed over the years, and we live in an age of 24-hour news. Do we really need the news to be delivered to us every minute of the day? There aren't enough stories to go around, and so instead we fill the spaces in our newspapers and on our televisions and on the internet with comment and debate and analysis and criticism. And not only this, we've also started to put our news in our public spaces, even though nobody asked us whether we wanted this or not. So you can walk into supermarkets and find the news headlines. Sometimes you'll find them in petrol stations. They're in the Barclays Bank in Brighton. If I want to go in and make a transaction, I'm force-fed the headlines of the news. And these next three pictures were taken in Victoria Station a couple of weeks ago. All of these pictures were taken within 5 minutes of each other, and they neatly sum up the news. The first one was tragedy. The second one was about a scandal. And the third one was showbiz news. I didn't get a chance to take a photo of the story, but it was that Robbie Williams is having a baby. We need to know this stuff. It's important. There is a book by Nick Davis called Flat Earth News, if you're interested to know where your news stories actually come from. Well, according to Davis, who is an award-winning journalist, most of our news nowadays come from two wire agencies, Associated Press and Reuters. Over 60% of the stories that you are fed come from these companies. Less than 12% of news stories now are sourced directly by journalists. If you choose to read those free papers that are handed out before you get on the tube, over 85% of those stories come from these two wire agencies. What that means is that the majority of the news nowadays comes in the form of press releases. Perhaps it's our duty to follow the news to learn the truth. But isn't it more the case that we read the newspapers that best reinforce our own prejudices in the first place? If you have right-wing tendencies, you're going to read the right-wing press, and if you're left-wing, then the same. It's a rare individual who chooses to read a cross-section of the papers to get a clearer idea of what is actually happening in the world. This is the kind of prejudice that we are being fed. And of course, I realize that it's more insidious in the tabloids, and maybe you're more the kind of audience that read the broadsheets. And I certainly used to indulge in those hefty piles of weekend supplements that come with the broadsheets. And then it dawned on me that the majority of this stuff was advertorials and lifestyle culture. And I ask you, how much do we need Christmas wrapping paper designed by Victoria Beckham in our lives? Now, there was a news story that came out in the 80s about a famine in Ethiopia, and it changed people's lives, and it really played upon our compassion. I remember seeing those images of Ethiopia and being moved to tears in the way that Bob Geldof and people involved in Live Aid and other charities were, and the compassion that was generated by this really made a big difference. And I think when great tragedies happen in the world, this is certainly the case, the power that the news can have. But more often than not, our headlines have this kind of message. Now, the next lot of headlines I'm showing you are all again from that cross-section of one day of news in Norwich. And what these headlines do is they play upon our sense of self-righteous indignation. They're not asking us to be compassionate, quite the opposite. They're asking us to point the finger, to look for scapegoats. Don't we love pointing the finger and having somebody to blame for the problems of society? We like to blame politicians. We love to blame the bankers. I heard that teachers were considered the primary cause of the riots last year. And this, I think, is a rather insidious aspect of our news. And it's not encouraging anything life-affirming. I think quite the opposite. And because of this, I think we have a duty to give a greater sense of happiness to ourselves on a daily basis rather than force-feed all of the tragedy and scandal that the news serves up on a daily basis. And because of this, I offer a very simple manifesto for a way for you to change your life, and that is to read less news, be more discerning about what you do read, Never accept free handouts, and by this I mean the kind of papers that are handed out on the tube. Swap the morning paper for a good book. And if the news in the morning on the radio depresses you, then turn that off as well. And I suggest starting the day by learning to play a musical instrument or listening to old episodes of Porridge. That's what I do. That will reassert your faith in humanity. Go for a walk, meditate, watch a TED lecture, listen to an inspiring podcast. Give up the news, and I promise you, you will be happier, or at very least, less depressed. Thank you very much.